In terms of talking about source of water quality contaminants, we can talk about two principal sources, so-called point sources and non-point sources. Point sources typically are concentrated in the landscape. They represent places where specific contaminants are distributed from the end of a pipe, discharged from the end of a pipe into a water body or a water feature. These include such things as industrial facilities and sewage treatment plants. There is an identifiable pipe that concentrates the contaminant as it flows into the landscape. Then the second source is called non-point sources. These are sources that are diffused throughout the landscape, and they relate to urban runoff and agricultural runoff. Now, in landscape planning, our principal focus is on mitigating non-point sources. We can do some mitigation of point sources, but our principal benefit is in terms of being able to mitigate the adverse consequences of indirect discharge of contaminants into water bodies. Non-point source contaminants move downhill from upland sources, and they accumulate in bottomland sinks. In this diagram, we can see the yellow area then representing conceptually an upland source area, some kind of contaminant that is creating a contaminant source. That contaminant source is moving from the upland source area into a bottomland sink. So we can talk about sources of contaminants and sinks of contaminants, and we can talk about the transportation of the contaminants from the source area to the sink area. So the trick really is to design watersheds that minimize movement of nutrients and contaminants from diffuse upland sources to bottomland sinks and outlets. We can talk about a wide assortment of non-point sources. The diagram in the upper right talks about suburban development, city streets, rural homes, forestry activities, animal feedlots, cropland, as being examples of non-point sources. They are diffused throughout the landscape. The contaminants are coming out of a subdivision, but no one particular house in particular. They're coming out of the entirety of the subdivision. We can see on the left side other kinds of non-point sources, pesticides and fertilizers running off of agricultural fields, landfills, septic systems, abandoned wells. These are all non-point sources. Even though they may emanate from a specific point, there are several of these points distributed throughout the landscape. So the criterion of being a distributed source of contamination is fulfilled as a non-point source. In the lower right, we can see specific kinds of activities that contribute non-point source contaminants, such things as wastewater disposal systems, agricultural systems, mining, logging. These are all examples of activities that have the potential, they don't always, but they have the potential to create non-point source contamination in the landscape. And this contamination, again, is moving from upland source areas, being removed from upland contaminant source areas and being discharged into bottomland sinks where the materials accumulate over time. And we can talk about the upland characteristics of the source area, in this case on the upper left being principally agriculture with some forestry intermixed, and then in the lower left being principally agriculture. And then we can talk about the characteristics of the bottom sink, the zone of accumulation. And of course, the ultimate contaminant sinks for Minnesota are threefold. On the one hand, the lower two-thirds of the state throughout central, southeastern, and southwestern Minnesota discharge into the Mississippi River system and eventually into the delta at the mouth of the Mississippi River, creating anoxic and contaminated conditions in the Gulf of Mexico. But we also have sources that are moving to the north, going through the Hudson's Bay, through the Red River of the North towards Hudson Bay. And then we also have contaminants that are moving to the east and northeast through the Great Lakes chain and the St. Lawrence River system.